Picture yourself trapped in a world where the horizon marked the absolute limit of human possibility. In 1900, if you needed to cross an ocean, you faced weeks of seasickness and storms. If urgent news needed to travel from coast to coast, even the fastest trains took days of bone-rattling journey through mountain passes and endless plains. The sky above remained as unreachable as it had been since the dawn of humanity, a vast blue ceiling that mocked every dreamer who dared imagine rising above the earth. For thousands of years, gravity had been humanity's silent jailer. Every civilization had gazed upward with longing. The ancient Greeks told stories of Icarus and his wax wings. Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines in his notebooks. Yet century after century passed with every human who ever lived, dying without experiencing what birds took for granted: the simple freedom of flight. What shocking discovery would two bicycle mechanics make that revolutionized human understanding of flight? How would a childhood toy spark an obsession that consumed two brothers' entire lives? What devastating setback nearly convinced them that powered flight was impossible, until they questioned everything science thought it knew about wings? And what moment of triumph on a windswept beach would last only 12 seconds, yet change the course of human history forever? In Dayton, Ohio, two unmarried brothers ran a modest bicycle shop on West 3rd Street. Neither Wilbur nor Orville Wright had finished high school. They had no university degrees, no wealthy patrons, no government funding. What they possessed was something far more valuable: a memory of wonder that began with a simple toy helicopter their father brought home, a fragile contraption that somehow defied the force that kept everything else earthbound. As we begin their remarkable journey tonight, that childhood moment of magic is about to transform into humanity's greatest leap. Picture yourself trapped in a world where the horizon marked the absolute limit of human possibility. In 1900, if you needed to cross an ocean, you faced weeks of seasickness and storms. If urgent news needed to travel from coast to coast, even the fastest trains took days of bone-rattling journey through mountain passes and endless plains. The sky above remained as unreachable as it had been since the dawn of humanity, a vast blue ceiling that mocked every dreamer who dared imagine rising above the earth. For thousands of years, gravity had been humanity's silent jailer. Every civilization had gazed upward with longing. The ancient Greeks told stories of Icarus and his wax wings. Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines in his notebooks. Yet century after century passed with every human who ever lived dying without experiencing what birds took for granted: the simple freedom of flight. In Dayton, Ohio, two brothers ran a modest bicycle shop on West 3rd Street. Neither Wilbur nor Orville Wright had finished high school. They had no university degrees, no wealthy patrons, no government funding. What they possessed was something far more valuable: a memory of wonder that began on an ordinary evening in 1878. Bishop Milton Wright returned home from a church trip carrying something unusual. As 7-year-old Orville and 11-year-old Wilbur gathered around, their father produced a peculiar toy from France called a helicopter. Made of cork, bamboo, and paper, it looked fragile enough to crumble at a touch. But when Bishop Wright wound its rubber band and released it, the toy did something magical. It flew. Not just flew, but soared upward, spinning its twin propellers with a whirring sound that filled the modest parlor with possibility. The boys watched, transfixed, as this simple contraption defied the force that kept everything else earthbound. When it finally fluttered to the floor, they immediately picked it up, studying its construction with the intensity of scholars examining an ancient text. A question formed in their young minds that would consume the rest of their lives: if this tiny thing could fly, why couldn't something bigger carry a person? Their mother, Susan Wright, encouraged this mechanical curiosity. In her small workshop behind the house, she taught her sons that any problem could be solved through patient observation and careful measurement. She showed them how to work with their hands, how to think through difficulties step by step. Under her guidance, the boys learned to see the world not as fixed and unchangeable, but as a series of puzzles waiting to be solved. When Susan died of tuberculosis in 1889, the loss drew the brothers even closer. Neither would ever marry. They would share not just a home, but every meal, every decision, every dream. Their bond became so complete that in later years, they often finished each other's sentences and could work side by side for hours without speaking, each knowing exactly what the other was thinking. In their bicycle shop, they discovered something profound about balance. A bicycle shouldn't be able to stay upright. It's essentially an unstable machine that wants to fall over. Yet through countless tiny adjustments, a rider maintains equilibrium. Balance wasn't a fixed state, but a continuous dance of corrections. This revelation about dynamic stability would prove crucial when they turned their attention from two wheels on the ground to wings in the air. The spark that reignited their childhood fascination came in 1896. News arrived from Germany about Otto Lilienthal, the flying man, who had made over 2,000 glider flights. The brothers devoured every article they could find about his experiments. Then came devastating news. Lilienthal had crashed, dying from his injuries. His reported last words haunted them. Sacrifices must be made. But the Wright brothers saw something in Lilienthal's tragedy that others missed. Previous experimenters had focused on power, assuming that with a strong enough engine, they could force their way into the sky. It was like trying to build a racing car before learning to steer. The Wrights realized that control came first. Master that and power would follow. In May 1899, Wilbur composed a letter to the Smithsonian Institution. With characteristic modesty, he wrote, "I am an enthusiast, but not a crank in the sense that I have some pet theories as to the proper construction of a flying machine. I wish to avail myself of all that is already known." The Smithsonian sent pamphlets, technical papers, everything available about flight. The brothers studied each document with the intensity of detectives investigating a crime. What they discovered shocked them. As they created detailed charts comparing different experimenters' data, a troubling pattern emerged. The numbers didn't match. Measurements of air pressure on curved surfaces, the fundamental basis of wing design, varied wildly between sources. Most published data about flight wasn't just incomplete, it was wrong. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an empty inner tube box. Wilbur was talking with a customer in the bicycle shop, absently twisting the rectangular box in his hands. As the cardboard flexed and warped, something clicked in his mind. This was how birds turned, not by shifting their weight like Lilienthal, but by changing the shape of their wings. If you could warp an aircraft's wings the same way, you could achieve true control. They tested this wing warping concept on a 5-foot biplane kite in the summer of 1899. Standing in a field outside Dayton, they pulled control lines and watched their kite respond like a trained bird, banking left and right on command. For the first time in history, humans had achieved controlled flight, even if their craft was too small to carry a person. As bicycle season ended each fall, the brothers transformed their shop into an aviation laboratory. Miniature wings covered every surface. Propeller designs hung from the ceiling. Endless calculations filled notebook after notebook. Their obsession grew so complete that friends began to worry about their health. But the Wrights knew they were close to something extraordinary. By 1900, they had progressed as far as theory could take them. They needed wind, steady, strong wind, and a place to test full-size gliders without endangering crowds or crashing into buildings. They wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau, requesting data about wind conditions across America. They sought the perfect combination: consistent breezes, soft landing surfaces, and blessed isolation. The response highlighted a remote location that seemed almost too good to be true. Off the coast of North Carolina lay a narrow strip of sand called Kitty Hawk. Here, Atlantic winds blew steady and strong. Sand dunes promised forgiving landings for the inevitable crashes. The nearest town was miles away, offering the privacy they craved. As summer turned to fall in 1900, the Wright brothers faced a momentous decision. They could continue their comfortable life in Dayton, running their successful bicycle business, respected members of their community. Or they could risk everything: their reputation, their savings, possibly their lives, on a journey to this distant beach. They looked at their calculations one more time. They thought of Lilienthal's sacrifice, of centuries of dreamers who had tried and failed. They remembered that toy helicopter spinning upward in their childhood home, defying gravity with its paper wings. The choice, when they finally made it, felt inevitable. They would go to Kitty Hawk. they would test their theories against the wind and sand. They would either join the long list of failed flying machine cranks, or they would finally give humanity what it had dreamed of since the first human looked up at a bird and wondered, what if? Feel the brothers' mixture of excitement and terror as they packed their first glider into crates in September 1900. Each carefully wrapped wing rib represented years of calculation, each wire a thread in their dream of flight. They moved through their bicycle shop with deliberate care, wrapping spruce spars in canvas, cushioning delicate fittings with sawdust. Their hands, so steady when building bicycles, trembled slightly as they sealed the crates. They were shipping these fragile assemblies to a place they'd never seen, to test theories that existed only in their notebooks and their wind-warped kite. The weight of what they were attempting pressed down on them. Men had died trying to fly. Good men, smart men, careful men. Now they were joining that dangerous fraternity, leaving the safety of their workshop for the unknown dangers of coastal winds and experimental flight. The train journey south stretched endlessly, through Ohio, across Virginia, into the unfamiliar landscape of North Carolina. Each mile took them further from everything familiar, deeper into an adventure that felt increasingly surreal. When they finally reached Elizabeth City, the end of the rail line, they faced another challenge. No one wanted to take them across the Sound to Kitty Hawk. Locals spoke of the place with a mixture of pity and amusement. Why would anyone want to go to that God-forsaken strip of sand? When they finally found a boatman willing to make the journey, the crossing proved so rough that their supplies were soaked with spray, their stomachs churning with each wave. Their first glimpse of Kitty Hawk shattered their expectations. The Weather Bureau had mentioned a town. What they found were a handful of weather-beaten houses scattered across endless dunes, looking more abandoned than inhabited. Sand was everywhere, in the air, in their clothes, in their food from the moment they arrived. The few residents they met regarded them with friendly puzzlement. These well-dressed gentlemen from Ohio had come all this way to fly a kite? The postmaster, Bill Tate, offered them hospitality, but even he seemed skeptical of their true purpose. That first night, sleeping on the floor of Tate's home, they listened to the wind howling outside and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Setting up camp on the dunes proved harder than any calculation they'd made in Dayton. The wind they'd traveled so far to find now seemed determined to destroy everything they'd brought. Their tent whipped and snapped like a living thing, threatening to tear free and disappear into the Atlantic. Sand infiltrated everything: their bedding, their food, their instruments. They spent as much time fighting the elements as preparing for flight. Some nights they lay awake listening to the wind crescendo to hurricane force, wondering if their tent would survive until morning. The isolation felt complete. They were hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by sand and sea, with only their faith in their calculations to sustain them. When they finally assembled their glider and attempted their first tests, disappointment crashed over them like the Atlantic waves. The machine that should have easily carried a man could barely lift itself. Their carefully calculated wing area, based on published tables of air pressure, produced less than half the expected lift. They flew it mostly as a kite, watching it buck and twist in the wind like an angry animal. The few times Wilbur attempted to ride it, he managed only brief hops, skimming a few feet above the sand before the glider dumped him unceremoniously back to Earth. Their revolutionary control system worked, but what good was steering a machine that wouldn't fly? Still, those few seconds of gliding awakened something primal in them. For those brief moments, Wilbur had felt the sand fall away, felt himself supported by nothing but air and forward motion. It was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. The glider wanted to pitch up and stall or dive toward the ground, fighting his every input. But for those heartbeats when everything balanced, when the machine skimmed smoothly above the dunes, he experienced what no living human had felt: true flight, controlled and deliberate. They returned to Dayton with their confidence shaken, but their determination hardened. They had tasted flight, however briefly. Now they needed to understand why their calculations had failed so spectacularly. Back in their bicycle shop, they faced a troubling realization. Either their math was wrong, or the published data about air pressure on curved surfaces data that every flying machine experimenter relied upon, was incorrect. The second possibility seemed absurd. This data came from respected scientists, had been published in engineering journals, formed the foundation of aeronautical knowledge, but the Wright brothers had learned to trust evidence over authority. If the accepted numbers didn't match their experience, then the numbers were wrong. They decided to generate their own data, to measure for themselves what actually happened when air flowed over a wing. Building a wind tunnel in a bicycle shop sounds ambitious until you understand the Wright brothers' genius for practical solutions. They created a 6-foot wooden box, placed a fan at one end powered by their shop's overhead belt system, and added a glass window for observation. Inside, they mounted tiny wings on delicate balances they crafted themselves. Through hundreds of patient tests, they measured lift and drag on different airfoils, accumulating data no one had ever gathered before. They became the first people in history to systematically study aerodynamics, transforming their shop into the world's first aerospace research facility. The work was tedious beyond description. Day after day through the winter of 1901, they tested over 200 wing designs. Each test required careful setup, precise measurement, meticulous recording. Their notebooks filled with columns of numbers, each representing hours of patient observation. But patterns emerged from the data, beautiful patterns that revealed the true behavior of wings in moving air. They discovered that the accepted coefficient for air pressure was off by nearly 60%, a massive error that explained why every previous flying machine had failed. Armed with accurate data, they could finally design wings that would actually fly. Their 1901 glider incorporated everything they'd learned. Larger wings based on their wind tunnel data, a forward elevator for pitch control, their proven wing warping system for roll. They returned to Kitty Hawk with high hopes, certain that this year would bring success. The disappointment when it came felt crushing. The new glider flew worse than their first machine. It barely lifted from the ground, and when it did fly, it proved almost impossible to control. The forward elevator was too sensitive, the wings still didn't produce enough lift, and the whole machine felt dangerously unstable. After weeks of frustrating tests, they packed up and headed home, their dreams seemingly shattered. On the train back to Dayton, Wilbur spoke words that revealed the depth of his despair. Not in 50 years, he told Orville, would humans achieve powered flight. They had given it their best effort, applied scientific method more rigorously than anyone before them, and still failed. The problem seemed insurmountable. But even in his darkest moment, Wilbur couldn't quite let go. Back in their shop, surrounded by their wind tunnel data and failed designs, the brothers did what they did best. They questioned everything. If their new data was correct, why had their glider failed? They reviewed every assumption, every calculation, every decision. The answer, when it came, was elegantly simple. Their wind tunnel tested wings in isolation, but on their glider, the wings interacted with each other and with the elevator. These interactions changed everything. They needed to account for the complete system, not just individual components. With growing excitement, they returned to their data, redesigning their aircraft with this new understanding. Their 1902 glider would be different. Longer, narrower wings for efficiency, and most importantly, a movable rudder that could be coordinated with wing warping. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a fundamental breakthrough in aircraft control. Returning to Kitty Hawk in 1902, they carried with them 3 years of accumulated knowledge. They had solved the data problem, understood system interactions, and designed a control system that promised true 3-axis control. Still, they approached their first flights with caution. Too many disappointments had taught them humility. But when Orville made the first tentative glides, something magical happened. The glider flew exactly as predicted. It lifted smoothly from the dunes, responded precisely to control inputs, and carried him hundreds of feet through the air with a stability that felt almost supernatural after their previous experiences. Day after day, they pushed the envelope further. Glides stretched from hundreds of feet to over 600. Time aloft increased from seconds to 20, 30, even 40 seconds. They learned to execute smooth turns, to control their altitude precisely, to land exactly where they intended. The glider had become an extension of their bodies, responding to subtle shifts in the control surfaces with predictable, repeatable results. They had solved the problem that had defeated every experimenter before them, the problem of control. As Wilbur wrote to their sister, they now had a machine that would fly for hours if only it had the power to sustain itself. The power problem loomed before them like the final examination in their long education. They calculated exactly what they needed, an engine producing at least 8 horsepower while weighing no more than 200 pounds. They contacted engine manufacturers explaining their requirements, only to be met with laughter or silence. No existing engine came close to their specifications. Automobile engines were far too heavy. Motorcycle engines lacked power. The few companies experimenting with lightweight engines wanted nothing to do with the crazy flying machine builders. If they wanted an engine that met their needs, they would have to build it themselves. Charlie Taylor, their bicycle shop mechanic, became the third crucial member of the team. Together, they designed a 4-cylinder engine that seemed impossibly crude by automotive standards. No fuel pump, gravity would feed the fuel. No radiator, the engine would cool itself in flight. No carburetor, just a simple valve to drip fuel into the intake. Every decision prioritized weight savings over sophistication. The resulting engine was a masterpiece of purposeful design, producing 12 horsepower while weighing just 180 pounds. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't smooth, but it was exactly what they needed. The propeller problem proved even more vexing than the engine. Ships used propellers, but marine theory proved useless for aerial application. Water was 800 times denser than air, making ship propeller designs completely wrong for their purposes. Once again, they had to start from first principles. A propeller, they realized, was just a rotating wing. It needed to generate thrust, the same way a wing generated lift. They applied their hard-won knowledge of airfoils to create the first scientifically designed aircraft propellers, achieving an efficiency that wouldn't be significantly improved for decades. By late 1903, they had assembled all the pieces of the puzzle. A proven glider design, an engine that met their exact requirements, propellers that could convert that power into thrust. They spent the summer building their powered flyer, incorporating everything they'd learned over 4 years of experimentation. The machine that took shape in their bicycle shop was both crude and sophisticated, a collection of wood, wire, and fabric that embodied thousands of hours of thought and calculation. As autumn approached, they prepared for their return to Kitty Hawk, aware that they carried humanity's best hope for conquering the sky. The journey south in 1903 felt different from previous years. They weren't just testing theories anymore. They were attempting something that had never been done. Their crates contained not just a glider, but a complete powered aircraft. Every component had been tested individually, but no one knew what would happen when it all came together. Would the engine's vibration tear the delicate structure apart? Would the propellers provide enough thrust? Would their control system work under power? The questions multiplied with each mile, but underneath the anxiety lay a bedrock of confidence. Their calculations were right. Their design was sound. If they could just get everything to work together, they would fly. Setting up camp at Kitty Hawk had become routine, but assembling the powered flyer required new levels of care. The engine had to be mounted precisely to maintain balance. The chain drives connecting the engine to the propellers needed exact tension. Every wire, every bolt, every connection could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. They worked with the patience of watchmakers, checking and rechecking each component. The weather turned cold, with freezing winds that made their fingers numb, but they pressed on. Winter was closing in, and they were running out of time. Mechanical problems plagued them from the start. The engine, so carefully crafted in Dayton, proved temperamental in the coastal cold. Propeller shafts cracked under the vibration. Sprockets came loose. Each problem required patient diagnosis and repair, eating up precious days of good flying weather. When a propeller shaft cracked badly enough to require replacement, Orville had to make the long journey back to Dayton for repairs. The delay felt agonizing. Other experimenters were working on powered flight. Samuel Langley, with government backing and a huge budget, had attempted flights that fall. They had failed, but someone would eventually succeed. The Wright brothers felt the pressure of history pressing down on them. December 14, finally brought everything together. The engine ran smoothly, the propellers spun without vibration, the weather was calm. They flipped a coin to see who would make the first attempt. Wilbur won. With Orville running alongside to steady the wing, Wilbur opened the throttle and felt the machine accelerate down their launching rail. For a moment, everything worked perfectly. The flyer lifted from the rail, climbing into the air under its own power. Then Wilbur, over-controlling in his excitement, pulled back too hard on the elevator. The machine climbed steeply, stalled, and crashed back into the sand after just 3 seconds aloft. The front elevator was damaged, but not severely. More importantly, they had proven the machine could fly. It had lifted under its own power, if only briefly. 2 days of repairs followed, with the brothers working in bitter cold to fix the damaged elevator. December 17th dawned with a biting wind from the north, gusting to 27 miles per hour. It wasn't ideal flying weather, but winter was closing in. This might be their last chance. They prepared the flyer carefully, running the engine to warm it up, checking every control. 5 witnesses from the nearby life-saving station had come to watch, along with a few curious locals. The brothers set up their camera, hoping to capture whatever might happen. It was Orville's turn to fly. As Orville took his position on the lower wing, lying prone with his hands on the controls, the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just another glider test. This was an attempt at powered, controlled, sustained flight, something that had never been achieved in all of human history. Wilbur positioned himself at the wingtip, ready to run alongside and steady the machine during its acceleration. The engine clattered to life. The propellers began their rhythmic beating against the air. Orville released the restraining wire, and the flyer began to move forward into the wind. What happened next lasted only 12 seconds, but those 12 seconds changed everything. The flyer accelerated down the rail, with Wilbur running alongside. At about 40 feet, the machine lifted into the air, climbing gradually as Orville fought to maintain control in the gusting wind. The elevator proved as sensitive as ever, causing the flyer to undulate through the air like a ship in rough seas. But it flew, under its own power, controlled by human hands, carrying its pilot through the air for 120 feet before touching down on the sand. Orville had done it. Humans could fly. The brothers stood in the cold wind, looking at their machine sitting on the sand where it had landed. No celebration, no cheering, just a quiet acknowledgement of what they had achieved. They had work to do. This was just the beginning. They hauled the flyer back to the starting point for another attempt. Over the next hour, they made 3 more flights, alternating turns as pilot. Each flight was longer than the last as they learned to handle their machine in the difficult conditions. Wilbur's final flight covered 852 feet in 59 seconds, proving beyond doubt that they had created a practical flying machine. Then, in a moment of cruel irony, nature reminded them of its power. As they stood discussing the morning's flights, a sudden gust of wind caught the unattended flyer. Before they could react, their machine was tumbling across the sand, breaking spars, tearing fabric, tangling wires into an unrepairable mess. The machine that had just given humanity wings would never fly again. But it had done its job. In 4 flights on a cold December morning, the Wright brothers had proven that humans could fly. The age of flight had begun. Born from bicycle shop ingenuity, methodical experimentation, and the unshakable belief that problems could be solved through careful thought and persistent effort. The flyer sat crumpled on the sand like a broken bird, its fabric torn and spars snapped from the wind's violent assault. Yet as Orville and Wilbur surveyed the wreckage, they felt no despair. Their machine had done what no machine had ever done before. 4 times that morning, it had carried a human being through the air under its own power, controlled and sustained. The longest flight, Wilbur's final attempt, had lasted nearly a minute, covering 852 feet of North Carolina beach. They had proven the impossible possible. Now came the harder task, convincing the world. The telegram they sent to their father that afternoon was characteristically modest. Success 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind, started from level with engine power alone. Average speed through air 31 miles longest, 57 seconds, informed Press Home Christmas. Bishop Wright dutifully contacted the Dayton newspapers, but the response was crushing. Editors who had heard too many false claims about flying machines dismissed the news. One reporter allegedly responded that if God had intended man to fly, he would have given him wings. The few papers that did print the story garbled the facts so badly that the accounts bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. This skepticism followed them home to Dayton, where neighbors who had watched them leave with crates of aircraft parts now saw them return empty-handed. No photographs appeared in newspapers. No public demonstrations followed. To most observers, the Wright brothers seemed to have joined the long list of failed flying machine cranks. But in the privacy of their bicycle shop, the brothers knew better. They had flown. The question now was not whether flight was possible, but how to perfect it. Through 1904, they built a new flyer incorporating lessons learned at Kitty Hawk. The engine was more powerful, the control system refined, the structure strengthened. They needed a flying field closer to home and found it in Huffman Prairie, a cow pasture 8 miles outside Dayton. The location was far from ideal, surrounded by trees prone to calm air, shared with a herd of cattle that had to be shooed away before each flight. But it offered privacy and convenience. Here they could fly daily, learning their craft without the long journey to North Carolina. The early flights at Huffman Prairie were humbling. Without Kitty Hawk's steady winds, takeoffs proved difficult. The new flyer, heavier than its predecessor, needed more speed to become airborne. They built a catapult system using a falling weight to provide extra acceleration, but flights remained short and erratic. Skeptical locals who came to watch often left disappointed, having seen nothing more than brief hops. The brothers didn't mind. Each flight, however short, taught them something new. By late summer, their persistence began paying dividends. Flights stretched from seconds to minutes. On September 20th, Wilbur flew the first complete circle, returning to land where he had started. It was a profound moment, not just traveling through the air, but navigating it, choosing his path and executing it perfectly. The local beekeeper, Amos Root, witnessed this flight and wrote the first accurate eyewitness account of the Wright brothers in flight. His article, published in his beekeeping journal, was largely ignored by the mainstream press. Through 1905, their mastery grew exponentially. The third Wright flyer was their best machine yet, with a more powerful engine and improved control surfaces. Flights that had been measured in seconds now lasted minutes, then tens of minutes. On October 5th, Wilbur remained airborne for 39 minutes, covering 24 miles in continuous circles over Huffman Prairie. They had solved not just the problem of flight, but the problem of practical flight. Their machine could take off reliably, fly as long as fuel allowed, execute any maneuver they commanded, and land safely where they chose. Yet still, the world remained largely unaware. The brothers had made a calculated decision to avoid publicity until they secured patent protection and found buyers for their invention. They understood what they had created, not just a curiosity, but a technology that would transform transportation, commerce, and warfare. Such power needed to be handled carefully. They stopped flying entirely in late 1905, spending the next 2 years in negotiations with governments and patent offices. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1907, the U.S. Army Signal Corps issued specifications for a military airplane. The requirements seemed almost impossible. Carry 2 people for at least an hour, fly at 40 miles per hour, be controllable by a person of average skill. The Wright brothers knew they could exceed every requirement. They submitted a bid and began preparing for the demonstrations that would finally reveal their achievement to the world. Meanwhile, aviation fever was building in Europe. French experimenters, inspired by sketchy reports of the Wright flights, were making their own attempts. When Wilbur arrived in France in 1908 to demonstrate their flyer, European aviators were confident they had caught up to or even surpassed the secretive Americans. That confidence evaporated on August 8, 1908, at the Hunaudière racecourse near Le Mans. Wilbur's first public flight in France lasted only 1 minute and 45 seconds, but it revolutionized aviation. The smooth banking turns, the perfect control, the effortless grace of his flying left spectators speechless. French aviators who had dismissed the Wrights as bluffeurs immediately recognized the vast gulf between their crude machines and this masterpiece of engineering. "We are as children compared to the Wrights," admitted one French pilot. Within days, Wilbur was the most famous man in Europe. Back in America, Orville was conducting demonstrations for the Army at Fort Myer, Virginia. The flights went brilliantly until September 17th, when a broken propeller caused the first airplane crash fatality. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge died, and Orville was severely injured. The accident highlighted aviation's dangers, but didn't diminish military interest. When Orville recovered and successfully completed the Army trials in 1909, the Signal Corps purchased the world's first military airplane. The transformation from secretive experimenters to international celebrities happened with stunning speed. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see the Wright brothers fly. They conducted demonstrations before presidents and kings, trained the first generation of military pilots, established flying schools in America and Europe. The Wright Company, formed in 1909, began manufacturing airplanes for eager customers worldwide. The bicycle shop mechanics from Dayton had become the fathers of aviation. But fame brought unexpected burdens. Patent lawsuits consumed increasing amounts of time and energy as competitors challenged their claims or infringed on their designs. Wilbur spent his final years in courtrooms instead of workshops, fighting to protect their invention. The stress took its toll. In April 1912, exhausted from constant travel and legal battles, Wilbur contracted typhoid fever. He died on May 30th, only 45 years old, leaving Orville to carry on alone. Orville continued flying and improving their designs, but his heart was never quite the same without his brother. He sold the Wright Company in 1915 and spent his remaining years as aviation's elder statesman, watching their invention evolve in ways they could never have imagined. By the 1920s, airplanes were carrying mail across continents. By the 1930s, passenger airlines were shrinking the globe. By the 1940s, military aviation was reshaping warfare on a scale that made their demonstrations at Fort Myer seem quaint. The speed of aviation's evolution was breathtaking. Just 16 years after Kitty Hawk, pilots were crossing the Atlantic. 25 years after that first flight, commercial aviation was becoming routine. 40 years later, jet engines were propelling aircraft faster than sound. The principles the Wright brothers had discovered in their wind tunnel, lift, drag, thrust, and control, remained fundamental, but the applications had grown beyond their wildest dreams. What they had unleashed was more than a new form of transportation. Flight changed how humans saw their world and their place in it. Cities that had been weeks apart were now hours away. Oceans that had been barriers became highways. The sky, which had been an unreachable ceiling since the dawn of humanity, became a new frontier for exploration and commerce. Every aspect of modern life, from fresh flowers shipped overnight to soldiers deployed across the globe, bore the fingerprint of their achievement. Yet perhaps their greatest legacy was not the airplane itself, but the method by which they created it. They had shown that the impossible could be made possible through systematic investigation, careful measurement, and persistent experimentation. They had proven that two ordinary people, without special education or resources, could solve a problem that had defeated humanity for millennia. Their wind tunnel data, their control system innovations, their methodical approach to flight testing, all became templates for how to push the boundaries of human capability. As aviation entered the jet age and then the space age, as aircraft grew from wood and fabric biplanes to aluminum jets to composite material marvels, the ghost of the Wright Flyer could be seen in every design. The same forces that had lifted Orville for 12 seconds on a December morning now carried millions of people safely through the skies every day. The dream of flight, once the province of myths and legends, had become so commonplace that passengers barely glanced out the window as they soared above the clouds. Standing in that moment after their fourth flight on December 17, 1903, watching their broken flyer scattered across the sand, the Wright brothers couldn't have imagined the full scope of what they had begun. They had given humanity wings, but more than that, they had shown that with enough determination, careful thought, and brotherly cooperation, any barrier could be overcome. The age of flight had dawned, and the world would never be the same. The world had changed so completely that passengers boarding the Boeing Stratocruiser in 1950 gave no more thought to defying gravity than their grandparents had given to riding a train. Just 47 years after those 12 seconds over Kitty Hawk sand, sleek aluminum aircraft carried travelers across oceans in pressurized comfort, serving hot meals at 20,000 feet, while cruising at speeds the Wright Brothers flyer could never have achieved in level flight. Children born after Kitty Hawk were now middle-aged business executives, flying between continents for meetings, treating as routine what had been impossible for every human who lived before 1903. The transformation of human consciousness happened gradually, then suddenly. In the 1920s, crowds still gathered to watch airplanes land, marveling at the defiance of natural law. By the 1930s, scheduled airline service made flight a luxury for the wealthy, but no longer a miracle. By 1950, with millions of passengers flying annually, boarding an aircraft had become as mundane as stepping onto a bus. The impossible had become invisible through sheer familiarity. Gravity hadn't changed, but humanity's relationship with it had shifted forever. What the Wright brothers unleashed was more than a new machine. It was an acceleration of human possibility itself. Aviation compressed geography, allowing fresh flowers picked in Colombia to grace New York tables the next morning. It enabled executives to have breakfast in London and dinner in New York. It let families separated by continents maintain relationships that would have withered in the age of sailing ships. Every aspect of modern life began moving at the speed of flight. Airmail service arrived first, transforming communication from a test of patience into an exercise in efficiency. Letters that once took weeks crossing the country by rail now arrived in days. Businesses could coordinate operations across vast distances with unprecedented speed. A contract signed in San Francisco could reach Chicago before the ink was fully dry. Families maintained connections across oceans through regular correspondence that arrived while news was still fresh. The psychological distance between places shrank as dramatically as the travel time. Entrepreneurs quickly grasped aviation's commercial potential. If people would pay to send mail by air, surely they would pay to fly themselves. Early airlines operated with the glamour of ocean liners and the reliability of weather forecasts, which is to say, uncertainly. But passengers came anyway, drawn by the intoxicating promise of speed. What had been a 2-week journey by ship became a 2-day flight. Tourism, once the province of the wealthy with months to spare, became accessible to anyone with a week's vacation. The world became a destination rather than a concept. Military strategists understood aviation's implications even faster than businessmen. The ability to see beyond the next hill had always been crucial in warfare. Now commanders could see beyond the horizon itself. Reconnaissance flights revealed enemy positions with clarity no cavalry scout could match. Supply lines could leap over impassable terrain, and most ominously, the battlefield itself could extend anywhere aircraft could reach. The Wright brothers had given humanity wings, but those wings could carry bombs as easily as passengers. World War I pilots took the Wrights' peaceful invention into a realm of violence its creators never intended. Young men who might have been bicycle mechanics in another era found themselves dueling above the trenches, their aircraft dancing through aerial ballets that ended in death. The romance of flight met the brutality of war, creating legends like the Red Baron, while proving that mastery of the air meant mastery of the battlefield. Each improvement in aircraft design, faster engines, better weapons, increased maneuverability, came written in blood. Between the wars, aviation technology evolved at breathtaking speed. The Wright Flyer's 12-horsepower engine gave way to power plants producing hundreds, then thousands of horsepower. Wood and fabric yielded to aluminum and steel. Open cockpits became enclosed cabins. Biplanes evolved into monoplanes. Each innovation built upon the Wrights' fundamental insights about lift and control. But the resulting aircraft bore as much resemblance to the original Flyer as a Formula One race car bears to a Model T Progress came through iteration, each generation learning from the last. The 1930s became aviation's golden age, when pilots pushed the boundaries of human achievement and captured global imagination. Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927 had shown what was possible. Amelia Earhart proved that aviation excellence knew no gender. Racing pilots pushed aircraft to speeds that seemed suicidal, while distance flyers opened routes across oceans and continents. Each record broken, each frontier crossed, expanded humanity's sense of its own capability. The Wright brothers had given people wings. Now heroes were showing how far those wings could carry them. World War II transformed aviation from an industry into a force that could reshape civilization. The Battle of Britain proved that control of the skies meant national survival. The Pacific War demonstrated that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the ultimate expression of naval power. Strategic bombing campaigns showed that no city was beyond war's reach. The atomic bombs that ended the war were delivered by aircraft, proving that the Wright brothers' invention had given humanity the power to destroy itself. The wooden struts and fabric wings of 1903 had evolved into aluminum instruments of apocalypse. Even as propeller-driven aircraft reached their zenith, a new revolution was beginning. Jet engines, developed secretly during the war, promised speeds that would make propellers obsolete. The sound barrier, once thought absolute, fell to Chuck Yeager in 1947. By the 1950s, jet airliners were shrinking the globe even further. A journey from London to New York that had taken 12 hours by propeller now took 6 by jet. The Wright brothers had conquered gravity. Now their successors were conquering time itself. The principles that lifted the Wright Flyer, thrust overcoming drag, lift overcoming weight, scaled up to spacecraft. The same control surfaces that had allowed Orville to navigate those first 120 feet evolved into systems that could guide rockets beyond Earth's atmosphere. When humanity reached for the stars, it did so using knowledge won through patient experimentation in a bicycle shop. The progression from Kitty Hawk to the moon took only 66 years, less than a single human lifetime. Some who had watched the Wright brothers fly lived to watch Neil Armstrong walk on lunar soil. As aircraft became safer and more economical, flight democratized. What had been an adventure for the daring became transportation for the masses. Families flew to vacations. Students studied abroad. Immigrants maintained connections with homelands. The airplane transformed from a symbol of privilege into a tool of everyday life. By the 1960s, more Americans had flown than had traveled by ship to Europe in all the centuries before flight. The Wright brothers hadn't just invented a machine, they had invented a new way of being human. Global commerce reorganized itself around aviation's possibilities. Fresh seafood from Tokyo appeared in Los Angeles restaurants the next day. Paris fashion shows influenced New York boutiques within hours. Manufacturing split across continents, with components made wherever economics dictated and assembled, wherever markets demanded. The global economy that emerged would have been impossible without reliable air transport. Every smartphone assembled from parts made in a dozen countries, every flower sold thousands of miles from where it grew, traced its possibility back to those 12 seconds in 1903. Aviation shattered cultural barriers as thoroughly as it had shattered geographical ones. Ideas, fashions, music, and art moved at the speed of flight. A song popular in London could be playing in Sydney within days. Fashion trends no longer took years to cross oceans. Cultural exchange accelerated from a trickle to a flood. The world became not just smaller, but more interconnected, with aviation serving as the circulatory system of global civilization. The isolation that had allowed cultures to develop independently for millennia ended with the jet age. Yet success brought unexpected consequences. Millions of aircraft burning billions of gallons of fuel altered the very atmosphere that made flight possible. The Wright brothers, concerned only with getting airborne, never imagined fleets of jumbo jets leaving contrails across the sky. The freedom of flight came with environmental costs that would challenge future generations. The same technology that connected humanity threatened the planet that sustained it. Progress, as always, came with a price. Into the 21st century, aviation continues evolving. Supersonic passenger jets promise to shrink travel times even further. Unmanned drones extend flight to purposes the Wrights never imagined. Electric aircraft offer hope for sustainable aviation. Experimental designs push the boundaries of speed, altitude, and efficiency. Each innovation builds upon the foundation laid in that bicycle shop, extending the legacy of two brothers who refused to accept human limitations. The quest for flight that began with watching birds continues with reaching for the stars. Today, as you prepare for sleep, approximately 10,000 commercial aircraft carry over 1 million passengers safely through the skies above. Each flight represents thousands of incremental improvements, millions of hours of engineering, billions of miles of accumulated experience. Yet every takeoff recreates that moment when Orville felt the ground fall away beneath him, when humanity first slipped the bonds of Earth through ingenuity and determination. The miracle hasn't diminished. We've simply grown accustomed to miracles. The Wright brothers gave us more than flight. They demonstrated that patient observation could unlock nature's secrets. They proved that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through methodical effort. They showed that the impossible was merely the not yet solved. Their legacy lives not just in every aircraft that flies, but in every problem solver who refuses to accept that things must remain as they've always been. In transforming humanity from earthbound to airborne, they transformed our understanding of what we could achieve. As you settle into rest tonight, remember that above you, thousands of aircraft are carrying millions of passengers safely through the darkness, each flight a testament to two brothers who looked at birds and refused to believe that humans were meant to remain earthbound forever. Their patient work in a bicycle shop, their careful measurements in a homemade wind tunnel, their persistent experiments on windswept dunes all culminated in a gift to humanity that reshaped civilization. The sky that had been our limit became our highway. Let their story of patient observation, methodical experimentation, and quiet determination carry you into peaceful sleep, knowing that the greatest breakthroughs often come not from dramatic inspiration, but from the steady accumulation of knowledge and the courage to question what everyone else accepts as impossible. Dream of flight, of freedom, of the moment when gravity lost its grip on human ambition. Rest easy in a world transformed by two brothers who dared to believe that we were meant to soar. The Wright brothers gave us more than flight. They demonstrated that patient observation could unlock nature's secrets. They proved that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through methodical effort. They showed that the impossible was merely the not yet solved. Their legacy lives not just in every aircraft that flies, but in every problem solver who refuses to accept that things must remain as they've always been. In transforming humanity from earthbound to airborne, they transformed our understanding of what we could achieve. As you settle into rest tonight, remember that above you, thousands of aircraft are carrying millions of passengers safely through the darkness. Each flight a testament to two brothers who looked at birds and refused to believe that humans were meant to remain earthbound forever. Their patient work in a bicycle shop, their careful measurements in a homemade wind tunnel, their persistent experiments on windswept dunes, all culminated in a gift to humanity that reshaped civilization. The sky that had been our limit became our highway. Let their story of patient observation, methodical experimentation, and quiet determination carry you into peaceful sleep, knowing that the greatest breakthroughs often come not from dramatic inspiration, but from the steady accumulation of knowledge and the courage to question what everyone else accepts as impossible. Dream of flight, of freedom, of the moment when gravity lost its grip on human ambition. Rest easy in a world transformed by two brothers who dared to believe that we were meant to soar. May your dreams tonight lift you as gently as their wings lifted them, carrying you through peaceful skies until morning light returns.